Hello. We're so glad that you joined us for ELA's Wednesday Walks in the Garden. I'm Penny Lewis, Executive Director of the Ecological Landscape Alliance. Welcome to gardeners from near and far. We hope that these virtual walks in the garden will add a bit of beauty to your day and inspire you to visit, create, and enjoy gardens in your area. Today, I'd like to introduce Dr. Nancy Lee Adamson, who will be inviting us to explore creating community with our insect neighbors. Dr. Adamson is an associate scientist at the International Center for Agricultural Research in the Dry Areas. As part of the Conservation of Pollinator Diversity for Enhanced Climate Change Resilience project, Dr. Adamson is supporting farming with alternative pollinators and will be based in Rabat, Morocco, once COVID restrictions are relaxed. She was formerly with the Xerces Society, where she worked as a partner biologist with the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. She loves sharing her passion for native plants and all the wildlife they support. Her specialty is native bees and habitat restoration. Welcome, Dr. Adamson.
Well, thank you so much, Penny, for inviting me, and to all of you for joining the program today. I hope you'll go home today thinking of ways you can add native diversity to your plantings or nursery offerings, and how you can help your clients and neighbors create even healthier and more beautiful communities. Thank you all so much for your good work supporting ecological landscaping. When Penny asked me to do the program, I was working with Xerces and NRCS, and as she mentioned, I started a new job with the Center for Agricultural Research in the Dry Areas, based in North Africa. And if you're interested in learning more about that work, you can subscribe to our e-newsletter at tinyurl.com, e-news-fap. So the take-home messages today are: enhance native diversity, both flowering through the growing season, and structural diversity, meaning using forbs, grasses, shrubs, and trees. The more types of native plants you grow, the more types of insects, other arthropods, and other wildlife you'll support. Enhancing diversity helps prevent pest outbreaks. Our newest gardeners are ecologically and community health oriented. And you know more than most of us. You can help raise awareness of and appreciation for connections between plants, wildlife, and our own well-being. You all know we depend on insect pollinators for food, but we also depend on them for forage crops, biofuel, oils, fibers, medicines, and construction materials. Allerton and Company estimate that 90% of wild plants depend on animal pollinators. That's an average between about 95% in tropical areas and 75 to 85% in temperate areas. And we all rely on plants for clean air and clean water. Native plants are among the fastest growing sector of the nursery industry, as highlighted in Garden Media's annual Garden Trends reports. For 2021, they highlight people's interest in supporting their communities, and a whopping 67% of adults growing or planning to grow edible plants, especially berries. Families want to spend quality time outside, and instead of huge lawns, they want spaces that support wildlife and that are healthy for children. I'm going to run through a few of the previous years, as they are powerful trends worth sharing with regional planners and community leaders. In 2019, 83% of landscape architects said the hottest trend is using native plants in formal and informal designs. Garden Media described a cultural shift from self-care to earth care. The year I discovered Garden Media, they highlighted how millennials seek wellness, life without synthetic chemicals, and gardens that support a healthy life, community, and world. Trends that have continued to grow since then. I included these photos of formal gardens in Greensboro, all of which are relatively new plantings, all using native plants in prime downtown real estate. So what more can we do? The desire for healthy landscapes and an understanding of what healthy encompasses do not always mesh. My millennial neighbors installed artificial turf and explained to me that they were helping the environment by keeping the plastic out of the landfill. Someone had convinced me they were doing the right thing, but failed to teach them about the importance of soil for water infiltration or the dangers for themselves, their dog, and our collective watershed as those plastics disintegrate into the air and soil. Nor do they understand how soil microorganisms break down dog poo residues while plastic holds on to them. And I wanted to tell one other story about a landscaper at Reston community in Virginia who gave butterfly talks every year about butterfly gardening. And one of her residents came to speak with her at the end of the growing season, and she said, you know, Melissa, I did everything that you recommended. I planted native plants, and I got host plants for particular butterflies, and I've been killing worms all summer long. And, you know, for many of us, that would just seem so amazing that somebody wouldn't know that caterpillars turn into butterflies. And so that's why I want to emphasize that you know more than most of us. In a podcast for Emergence magazine, Robin Wall Kimmerer suggests we rethink our economy, and she uses service berries as an example of how nature shares its abundance in order to thrive. She calls this the economics of reciprocity. At a minimum, if you share the podcast with clients, you may have a giant influx of requests for service berries. So here are some key ways we can protect pollinators and other wildlife. For inspiration, check out the work of bee cities and bee campuses across the country. When planning, I encourage folks to always include the ground crew from the get-go. This is not as easy as it sounds, and it requires building trust with people whose voices have not always been listened to. Provide opportunities for recognition for businesses, for neighbors, for individuals. Add signs to help people understand and connect. We'll talk more about diversity shortly. Eliminate or reduce pesticide use. Leave the leaves whenever possible to protect the millions of critters that overwinter in them. And as Bee City folks do gloriously, celebrate your good work together. As green industry folks or as friendly neighbors, you can really help others understand and learn about connections between pollinators and other insects and arthropods and the rest of our communities. All wildlife, including us, depend on insects and food webs. When bears get into honeybee colonies, they're going after the bee larvae more than the honey because the larvae are protein rich. Birds, even if they are primarily seed eaters as adults, nearly all feed insects to their young. For anyone interested in reconnecting with nature, I highly recommend Noah's Garden by Sarah Stein, Bringing Nature Home by Doug Tallamy, and Last Child in the Woods by Richard Louv, plus all their newer books. Doug Tallamy estimates that chickadees, relatively small birds, need more than 5,000 caterpillars for one clutch of babies. Birds and bees are central place foragers. That means they bring food back to their nests. They leave their nests and then they go back and forth. If they have to travel too far to find food, they won't be successful. Can you imagine all those unseen caterpillars in the trees and shrubs around you? In a study in the District of Columbia, Tallamy students found sunflower seeds in all the nests that failed. Sunflower seeds are tremendously rich in protein and oil, but young birds need the soft caterpillars and the particular nutrients in them in order to grow. Native plants support exponentially higher numbers of caterpillars than introduced species. I mentioned beaver here in this slide because of the terrible flooding much of the country has faced. A wonderful botanist and ecologist, Cecil Frost, shared research showing that in areas with beaver, damage flooding is greatly reduced compared to similar areas where beaver have been extirpated. This is because of the improved infiltration in soils affected by beaver dams. Even though it can be hard for us to see felling of trees by beaver, that kind of quote-unquote disturbance is part of a natural cycle that opens the canopy and allows more sunlight to reach understory plant communities. Anoles, frogs, and other amphibians benefit from openings in canopies for the same reason. The greater plant diversity in the understory supports a greater diversity of insects. We are gaining more and more understanding of how critically important microflora and fauna are in the soil and in our bodies. Xerces just published this wonderful new handbook, and two of the authors, Jennifer Hopwood and Stephanie Frischi, have given a couple webinars on soil life, highlighting the manual. And next week, they'll be conducting a short course using the handbook and associated shouting sheets. Understanding a little more about pollinator habitat needs can guide conservation. Just slowing down and taking a closer look will let you see how many visitors your plants support. Bees and other insects on flowers will never sting. They always fly away or try to hide if you get too close. Like us, they need food, shelter, water, which many get primarily from nectar, and protection from toxins. Sometimes when we talk about pollinator habitat, people focus on meadow or prairie plants. So I want to encourage you to think niche diversity. Try to create as many different kinds of habitat niches from the ground up: herbaceous layers, shrub layers, middle and upper canopies. You don't have to have dense shade, but especially in a public space or along pathways, you want to have places where people can be out of the direct sun while still enjoying a meadow or prairie or savanna. When planting for pollinators, it's important to provide pollen and nectar through the growing season. In terms of plants, many trees and shrubs are especially important in spring. Riparian habitats are especially important during times of drought. Fall blooming plants are vital for migrating insects such as monarch butterflies. Evolution ties native plant and wildlife communities together. Native plants have extra value we may not fully understand, something Doug Tallamy has really brought to our attention. He suggests that if people are worried about caterpillars chewing leaves, just step back a few feet and you don't even see it. So caterpillars need to hide from birds and other predators, and this one, which I hope you all can see, uses tiny bits of plant materials to camouflage itself. So I'm always encouraging people to protect wetlands and riparian areas whenever possible. These are not only vital for wildlife, but are wonderful urban refuges and suburban and rural refuges for all of us. But we're seeing them threatened more and more in more urban places. We are facing higher frequency and more extended periods of high temperatures. Heat stress affects animals and plants and can affect the availability of nectar and pollen. Pollinator plantings in natural areas have broad benefits for pollinators and for us. Besides providing crucial habitat, they can help link habitat corridors. When flowering shade trees are included, they can help reduce temperatures and energy use for air conditioning that adds heat outside buildings. This next section focuses on basic info about bees and other invertebrates, aiming to help you build understanding of and appreciation for, quote, the little things that run the world, unquote, as E.O. Wilson says. We use the term beneficial insects to refer to insects and other arthropods that benefit agriculture. Pollinators, predators like wasps, flies, ladybugs, and spiders, and parasitoids that include other kinds of wasps and flies. We use the term parasitoid to refer to a kind of parasite that is generally kills its host and is often about the same size as its host, whereas a typical parasite that we might have usually would not kill us. Beneficial insects is shorthand and includes spiders and other organisms that aren't technically insects. As ecologically minded landscapers and gardeners, you know that everything is connected and beneficial in some ways in its community. Tools like iNaturalist and Seek by iNaturalist are absolutely wonderful. Besides identification, they help people connect both to each other and to the natural communities. And they also add understanding about connections in those communities. I like to show this slide to illustrate how iNaturalist may help us discover unrecognized connections. We know the pipevine swallowtail butterfly's caterpillar depends on Dutchman's pipe or pipevine. Caterpillars often move off their host plants to pupate. Seeing how these chrysalises blend in on yellow birch makes me wonder how important its pupation site is to its survival. As more of us document our sightings on iNaturalist, we may begin to understand that yellow birch has a bigger role in the pipevine swallowtail's survival in a way that we never could have understood without such an expansive monitoring tool. And this could really change how we practice conservation. In case you have not seen the adult butterfly, here it is. The adults are toxic to birds, so some mimics, such as the spicebush swallowtail, black morph of the tiger swallowtail, red spotted purple, and female Diana fritillaries, can be confused with them. Using iNaturalist or Seek can help you confirm an ID. Seek by iNaturalist was designed to engage children with challenges and rewards. It's also a wonderful identification tool. It's only available for phone and tablet. The iNaturalist program has additional capabilities on the full computer version. Another wonderful insect ID site is bugguide.net, and you can post your photographs there, and experts will identify them. Sometimes when I've been asked to help with pollinator plantings, people object because they're afraid of stinging insects or pollen. So I want to highlight why people don't need to worry about those things with pollinator gardens. Bees and wasps on flowers always fly away if approached. Around nests, only social bees and wasps are defensive, might sting if you get too close. You can deter social wasps from nesting by putting up a fake wasp nest in spring. When a new yellow jacket or paper wasp queen sees it, she assumes someone else is already nesting there, and she worries that there will not be enough food for her and her family, so she looks elsewhere to nest. The vast majority of bees and wasps are solitary. That means after emerging and mating, single moms make and provision nests alone. They don't have sisters, young larvae, a queen, or stored provisions to protect. We have a tremendous diversity of native bees. Most are solitary, not social, like honeybees. This means a single mom, when she mates, makes and provisions her nest alone. She never sees her young. Only colonies like honeybees, yellow jackets, and bumblebees have multiple generations living together and have stores to defend. You can help reduce fear of stings by helping people understand that insects on flowers are never defensive and that most bees are solitary. The Southeastern Blueberry Bee is a solitary species, but it often nests close to other Southeastern Blueberry Bees in aggregate nests because only certain soils are good for nesting. Solitary bees and wasps emerge at whatever time of year they are active, mate, and single moms dig nests or find cavities to nest in. If she's a bee, she collects just enough nectar and pollen in one cell for one egg. If she's a wasp, she may collect several caterpillars or a few stink bugs for each egg she lays. Wasps paralyze the prey they provide for their young, so it will be fresh when they hatch from their eggs. Whether a bee or wasp, neither mom ever sees her young hatch out and grow up on the provisions she provided. Roughly 70% of bee species build nests underground. Though solitary, they often aggregate nests since some soils are better for nesting. If it's the season when they are active, you only have to wait briefly before a female returns with nectar and pollen. Most species are active only a few weeks of the year, spending the rest of their life in the nest their mother made for them. So this is the rose mallow bee, also called cotton bee or okra bee. And so I'm just running that again, but they're really fun to watch. They add a little bit of water to the soil they're digging so they can throw out these little balls. About 30% of our native bees nest as solitary individuals in wood tunnels, usually hollow stems or the abandoned beetle borer holes found in dead trees or stumps. Besides enough flowers nearby nests for pollen and nectar, leafcutter bees need leaves for their nests, especially those with antimicrobial properties like roses, legumes like redbud or baptisia, or cottonwood and other willow family plants. The life cycle of these solitary tunnel nesting bees is similar to that of solitary ground nesting bees. However, the brood cells are typically constructed in a linear arrangement separated by a series of mud or leaf partitions. So thanks to Phyllis Stiles of Bee City, USA for this clip of a mason bee in a bee observation house. Mason bees and other bees and wasps that might nest in these bee observation houses are all solitary, so they're safe and fun to watch nesting. And I don't know, it's a little bit hard to see, but in the two cells behind her, there are eggs sitting on top of the pollen provision she's collected. So often a pencil-sized cavity like the one in the previous slide brings introduced species like Michaela felt in the previous clip. But this year I found a native mason bee, Osmia Buscephala, in the nest, and then I saw her foraging on this native Physalia. So I was just really excited to find her. Other cavity nesters and other solitary nesters include solitary predatory and parasitoid wasps that are not defensive. So if you provide a variety of sizes of bamboo closed at the back, you'll have mason bees in spring and leafcutter bees in late spring and summer. You'll also see predatory and parasitoid wasps. All of these are solitary species, so they will always hide or fly away if you approach them. They don't have colonies to defend. It's really fun to be able to see them up close. And mud dauber wasps that collect spiders will also use these cavities. It's good to teach others that when you see a whole row of mud dauber nests, that they are actually solitary wasps as well, unlike paper wasps or yellow jackets. Our wasp diversity is even greater, and again, the vast majority are solitary. This scoliid wasp lays her eggs in the grubs of Japanese beetles and other beetle grubs. You can sometimes see them kind of hovering above the ground, and they dig into the ground to lay their eggs directly on the grub in the soil. This braconid wasp somehow knows there's a caterpillar inside the flower head. Without the help of such parasitoids and spiders, we'd have way fewer seeds regenerating our native flora. Sand wasps are active just a few weeks in early summer and have figured out that the introduced brown marmorated stink bug is suitable food for their young. As an adult, she needs pollen and nectar. Notice the white stink bug she is carrying below her as she opens the nest she had dug earlier. Here, she carefully closes up the nest hole to protect her eggs and the stink bugs she collected for the wasp babies she will never see. Many adult predators and parasitoids feed only on nectar and pollen, while others, like ladybugs and assassin bugs, supplement their diets with pollen or nectar. Plants with extrafloral nectaries, like this bean in the bottom right-hand corner, attract predators with nectar when their fruit is ripening. This wasp will eat caterpillars that might otherwise eat the bean. Parasitic wasps are especially sensitive to pesticides since they live in their hosts, such as this tomato hornworm. By not using a pesticide, you're allowing 200 to 300 new parasitoid wasp adults to emerge and find other hornworm caterpillars. Xerces has this excellent habitat planning guide and scouting sheets available for free download. I want to highlight some information on specialist bees because they really need our help. 60% are rare. Pollen specialists only eat pollen from one species, one genus, or one family. They may collect nectar from a variety of sources. You can help document specialist bees on host plants in gardens or in natural areas. Jared Fowler and Sam Droege created this great list for the eastern U.S. Since then, Fowler has greatly expanded that list, adding phenologies showing months that each bee is active in the region. Plus, he's created a central and western list. When I did a specialist bee program in 2019, I discovered I couldn't find photos of many specialists, so I encouraged folks to try to stake the host plants out and capture photos of these bees. In the PDF copy of the slides, I included a few additional slides about these sites. Ohio just published a new specialist bee guide. Many states have new programs supporting native pollinators, so it's worth checking with your extension to see what's new. Not all adult butterflies or moths eat or sip nectar, but if they do as adults, they consume only nectar. Still, they may pick up pollen on their faces, bodies, and wings and can be important pollinators, especially for plants such as lilies and azaleas. Earlier, we talked about how bees and birds are central place foragers, traveling from their nests to bring back food to their young. Monarchs and other butterflies and moths travel through landscapes laying eggs and nectaring along the way. Habitat connectivity is vital for both kinds of foragers. Here again, using iNaturalist mapping features can help us find gaps in habitat that could guide conservation planning. In this section, I'm going to very quickly highlight some plants that are good for pollinators. Remember to check USDA plants database or bonapp.org if you want to be sure something is native to your area. We planted a diverse native hedgerow at NC A&T as a demonstration garden. You can find the plant list and a slideshow about the planting at this tiny URL, /diverse native hedgerow. This is a wonderful new tool for finding pollinator-friendly plants. I used to recommend clicking on the map and things, but then I discovered if you just click on your state, you can download the full list, or you can download what they call a workhorse list. And those are plants that are readily available from nurseries and are generally easy to establish. So it's a really neat tool. But if you want to just explore online, it has great pollinator information, as you can see by the number 3 there. To leave more time for discussion, I'm just going to scroll through the next few slides. They are all in the tinyurl.com/ecopollinators slide set. These slides were developed for the Southeast, so you need to check what's native in your area. We have a rich set of spring blooming trees, shrubs, and wildflowers. I like to point out that the black locust flowers are edible, and of course persimmons are fantastic food for us and other wildlife. Early spring blooming native shrubs and small trees include striped maple in the mountains and the bladdernut shown in this photo, which is visited by a huge diversity of pollinators. The early spring azaleas are especially important for the spring migration of hummingbirds. Thinking about these mid to late bloomers makes me want to plan a hike to see them all. Notice the pattern on the rose bay flower. It's a nectar guide, directing pollinators to the base of the flower. If we could see the flower with UV glasses, the directions would be even clearer. One I just added, so it's not in the online slide, but is excellent for the Southeast, is Calicarpa Americana, American beautyberry. Rings of delicate lavender-colored flowers in spring, gorgeous purple berries in fall, and easy to grow. My friend Flory Funk shared a beautiful and delicious jelly made with the berries. Many of our summer bloomers grow naturally in riparian or wetter sites, but nearly all grow well with average soil moisture. Notice the pollen on the swallowtail's body and wings. Vines can be a wonderful addition, especially for arbors, trellises, or other structures. It's so fun to walk through and see different caterpillars on different host species. And if you include passion vine, it's fun to harvest the fruit that you're walking below. The crossvine and coral honeysuckle both flower in spring and in fall, supporting hummingbirds migrating north and south. Passion vine is host for fritillary butterflies and is scrumptious to eat. You may know it as maypops. I'm waiting for someone to market passion vine kombucha. My friend Kim Bailey makes passion vine jelly, which she recommends eating on a croissant, so the delicate aroma comes forth. It's just superb. Lots and lots of wonderful native wildflowers. I didn't realize until this year how fragrant golden groundsel is, and with the warm sun yesterday was attracting bees, wasps, flies, and butterflies near me. Remember to include milkweeds. Xerces has a wonderful milkweed guide and a bunch of regional milkweed lists. These winter weeds can be really valuable forage, so try to leave them as long as you can before mowing or tilling in spring. Some roadside mowing, and especially herbicides, can be really frustrating to witness, especially if you like to collect seeds on roadsides. But periodic mowing can really help maintain diversity. Too frequent disturbance can reduce diversity and prevent flowering. Try to protect or provide nesting sites. And so that includes the plants for nesting, like the legumes and cottonwood. For cavity nesting bees, plant or conserve pithy stem species such as sumac, blackberry, black raspberry, rose, elderberry, and box elder. For bumblebees and birds, plant or conserve native grasses, leaves, or brush piles. So bumblebees, just like some of our ground nesting birds, like to nest under lodged grasses. That's like a warm season grass. When it falls over, then it actually leaves space underneath the fallen leaves where bees and birds are protected from rain and also from predators. If messiness is a concern, add signage or create wattles like these beautiful wattle fences Chris Luloya makes at the NC Botanical Garden. Support connections with nature and other communities. Monarchs across Georgia and Journey North help children connect in the US and Mexico with letters and art in the symbolic migration of monarchs. Look for inspiration from bee cities and bee campuses. They do public events and educational materials, and each affiliate works with communities in ways that work best locally. Horticulturalist Ann Barklow in Greenwood, South Carolina has been replacing turf with diverse plantings, adding native plants to existing plantings, and adding signs to promote pollinators. And she's a wonderful spokesperson. I encourage you to check out that little video. Pollinator-dependent plants do not cause hay fever. Only wind-pollinated plants that have dry, light pollen cause hay fever. You never see goldenrod or apple in our newspaper or pollen counts. Insect-pollinated plants have sticky, heavy pollen that needs to be carried. And I made a little video clip when I was at Virginia Tech. You can check that out too. But I just love this little schemata that was put together by folks in Southeastern Virginia showing what mason bees were collecting. And in the spring, it was mainly redbud and box elder, which is really interesting. And then some of these dark ones are things we don't always think of that they might collect, including oak. And then this dark green one is actually holly, and those are really wonderful for pollinators. Pesticides remain a huge concern for pollinators, other wildlife, and our health. Xerces has some terrific new brochures designed specifically for landowners and an excellent collection of annotated research articles care of this Impacts of Pesticides on Invertebrates database. I'm not sure many people know about it since it doesn't have Xerces in the URL, and that is pesticideimpacts.org. Phyllis Stiles, who started Bee City USA, times her newspaper articles seasonally. Late summer is the time to remind people that leaving leaves can have huge benefits for protecting diverse insect populations overwintering. Signs let people know that unmown or unpruned areas are intentional. If you have kids or grandkids, their signs are the most engaging, and we can learn what they see. I highly recommend this video. What a powerful way to help children and adults really begin to understand the need to protect and support the natural communities we have. In the video, children walk through the town carrying either the ghosts of monarchs or the 10% that can still be seen migrating. They end at an art and poetry show they created. So this is one of the art pieces and a haiku on display at the parade destination. So here are a few resource ideas. Of course, Xerces has a ton of great resources for free online. If you want to learn more about bees, I highly recommend getting Olivia Carroll and Joe Wilson's The Bees in Your Backyard. And then coming in July is their new book, Common Bees of Eastern North America. Heather Holmes' books are all excellent too, with the added benefit of tons of plant info. And of course, you all met her for her specialist bee program last spring, which you can see on the Ecological Landscaping Association YouTube site. More and more states have native or wild bee extension and monitoring programs that include native bee training. And again, this is a wonderful podcast coming out of Oregon, but it covers lots of topics related to pollinators and plants. So here are some of the free Xerces publications. We have a lot more information, not just about pollinators, a whole bunch of really great stuff related to aquatic wildlife and fireflies. Mm-hmm. And Xerces now has a wonderful library of videos posted on their YouTube channel. I have a few videos posted on YouTube too. If you search on Southwest Virginia crop pollinators or Melitology Nancy, you can find them. And just a reminder, there's a copy of this presentation along with resources at tinyurl.com/ecopollinators. And just wanted to remind you that we're coming to the end of the program, so you can type a question in the box. And well, it looks like we'll have plenty of time for a little discussion at the end. So I want to thank you for supporting diversity. Hope you have time to stay and talk for a few minutes. Keep in mind Richard Louve's thoughts from Last Child in the Woods. Can we teach children to look at a flower and see all the things it represents? Beauty, the health of an ecosystem, and the potential for healing? So here's my contact information, and thanks again.
We have lots of questions for you, Dr. Adamson. The first is,
Okie doke.
it seems that minor bees, which I've only seen in a community, spend a lot of time hovering and flying a few inches over their nest. Why is that behavior?
So I suspect that those bees that you're seeing may be kind of reddish or yellow in color. And if they are, those are probably actually parasitic bees, Nomada or I think Cicodes. And so some of those parasitic bees are actually good for helping locate the mining bee nest sites and other nest sites. And but it could also be male bees hanging around waiting for females. And so it just depends. And if you want to take a little video and send it to me, then I could give you a better answer about that.
Excellent. Is it true that only female bees can sting?
Yes, that is true. And that's a great point that I should have included in the talk. Especially a good example to share with people is Carpenter bees, because the males are the ones that are territorial, and they'll come and check you out, and they're just checking to make sure you're not another male bee honing in on their territory, but they don't have stingers. And some old honeybee keepers tell me stories of not telling their grandkids that those bees didn't have stingers and impressing them by grabbing those big, gigantic carpenter bees out of the air. So,
very good. If you create a bamboo bee nest, do you have to worry about cleaning them or replacing them?
yes. So Xerces has a bunch of information about how to care for bee nests. And I had made recommendations to friends to put their old bamboo nests in a box with just one hole at the front, so that they would have an exit hole, but were less likely to return. But based on my friend's experience, that they weren't fooled. So it can be a little bit tricky to do that with some of our, if you're using a diverse set of cavity nests. If you're using some of the commercial nests, then most of those can be opened up. But if you have, what I recommend is a diverse set of holes, then you're going to have not just bees in those nests, but you'll also have wasps and some things that might not have pupal cases. And so I met a young fellow who has been working with those bamboo nests for a long time. And what he does is at the end of the season, he'll put the bamboo in a little vise, and he will gently cut it open from the back. So, you know, you want to be careful not to cut yourself, but if you just pry that open a little bit, then you can gently, if you just get a little bit of an insertion at the back, then you can pry that open, and you can see which of the pupae are healthy, and you can store those in the refrigerator if you want. Some people actually recommend washing them in a little solution. But if you find live larvae that aren't in pupal cases, you don't want to store those in the refrigerator. They will desiccate. So if you find those, what he recommended was putting them in a little tin and storing them outside. You want to have an exit hole, and now the exit hole needs to be clean, so it can't be rough. If it's rough, then they might damage their wings when they're trying to fly out of that. He recommended tin because he found that mice would get into any cardboard that he put out. Where I live in North Carolina, in a more urban setting, I used to use some cardboard boxes, and I was able to just use a little hole punch to make the exit hole. And yeah, so I think I did include a bunch of information about nesting recommendations in the additional resource links that are also posted at the tiny URL. And Penny's gonna email those to you all as well.
Very good. I've never seen parasitized caterpillars. What strategies can I use to spot some?
Oh, okay. So, yeah, you know, that's just part of a natural cycle, and we don't know for sure, but just like we think that a lot of predators of mammals tend to go after the weaker or sick in a population, that may also be true of caterpillars. It's not always true. We have a ton of ladybird beetles at my community garden, and I think they end up eating all of the monarch eggs on the milkweed there. So the best strategy is just to create habitat niches in lots of different places. We don't really encourage you to try to interfere with those parasitic wasps. They have a role in the environment. Like I said, the ones that are laying their eggs in caterpillars that are in the heads of flowers are actually helping to ensure some of our seeds come through. If you collect seeds, you've probably tried collecting a seed head and discovered that it was completely eaten either by caterpillars or by weevils in the flower head. So they serve a role in the environment.
Very good. This may cause a little bit of discussion. The comment is that garden designers such as James Hitchmow and Kelly Norris seem to emphasize that we need diversity in plantings rather than just focusing on natives, and that we should not necessarily demonize non-natives. That in fact, some natives crowd out other natives, with the net result being less plant diversity and therefore less insect diversity. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think there's some, you can include some non-natives that serve a function in the landscape. The designer, who wrote Planting in a Post-Wild World, she talked about how in Germany that you can get information about the aggressiveness of plants. And so I think that just understanding a little bit about the natives, you can choose one that is not too aggressive for the particular planting that you have. I am pretty sure that I could probably recommend a plant to fit that niche. But on the other hand, I know like the highline, they use some plants that are not native, but they're really focused on creating as much diversity as possible. And that's good, but again, we understand that even though in particular in the studies by Doug Tallamy, he looked at plants in the same genus. So for instance, a Hamamelis from China versus a Hamamelis from the US, and the ones that evolved locally had much more diversity on them than the ones, even though they were the same genus and potentially had very similar semiochemicals. And then there's the other problems. For instance, we see one of the mustards that is invasive in this region that's not native. It has very similar semiochemicals. And unfortunately, our native butterfly that typically lays her eggs on our native mustards will lay her eggs on these garlic mustard, and her young don't develop and mature on those plants. so there's those kinds of connections, but I don't want to demonize, using some non-native plants, and I really just discourage using any invasive plants, and so I really would discourage those.
Okay. The book you referenced, Planting in a Post-Wild World, was by Claudia West.
Yes, thank you. And Thomas Rayner. Yeah.
Yes, good friend of ELA's.
Okay, great.
So what do you recommend for controlling ticks while providing a good mix of natives for pollinators?
Yeah, we were just talking about some creature that eats ticks, and I realized that a lot of you are more centered up in the Connecticut area where Lyme disease is a much bigger problem, and I don't have a good answer for that. And if I come up with some thoughts about that, I'll forward it to Penny, hopefully before next week when she writes to you all.
Okay, great. Someone wrote that they had not heard about tomato hornworms being parasitized, and they were curious if they should take the hornworms off, but take them off the tomatoes so they wouldn't damage their vegetables, but leave them in an area that would be good for the parasitic wasps.
Yeah, if if you're growing a lot of tomatoes and you're able to keep the hornworm in a container that would still allow the wasps to fly out of, then it would be worth your while keeping them off, but you'd still need to feed them. As you noticed in that picture, the hornworm looked healthy. It was perfectly green. When I think of parasitized hornworms, I think of them being black, but that one showed no sign that it was parasitized other than the fact that all those little pupae were on its back. So yeah, so that would be a good strategy. And one of the plants at the native hedgerow we planted in North Carolina gets a beautiful hornworm on it. It's called the Rustic Sphinx moth, and it looks just like a tomato hornworm. And one study I'd be curious about is if the same parasitic wasps are parasitizing those hornworms. They're a Sphinx moth caterpillar. Those would actually support. Then that could support tomato and tobacco plantings where tomato hornworm is a problem. So that would be an interesting research question, and I probably should write to some of the parasitic wasp folks and find out if they know what species are infesting them. But great question, thanks.
Very good. This is a comment. Thank you for mentioning the symbolic monarch migration. My young students became lovers of bugs through watching the monarch caterpillars in the classroom. They then became young ambassadors through the real and symbolic migrations. It's amazing how insects can expand our world.
Oh, great. It's a really powerful program. So yeah, thanks for mentioning that.
Okay, next question. With leaf litter, it is wise to remove 20 years of debris from the woods, dead limbs, twigs, and black moldy leaves? I think it maybe was mistyped. Maybe is it wise to remove debris
So yeah,
and dead
I'm sorry,
limbs?
I kind of skimmed over leaving the leaves, but so there's not like one story that fits all. For instance, around here, we've lost a lot of our longleaf pine ecosystems, and because fire has been suppressed, then the duff layer has actually gotten so thick that if a fire went through, it would basically kill all the pines in it instead of helping to rejuvenate that ecosystem. So in that ecosystem, before they reintroduce fire that has been suppressed for many, many years, they actually have to dig out all of the dust from the base of the big pines so that it will prevent a slow burning fire from killing them. So depending on your situation, in general, if you have a intact forest that has stuff, I can't imagine it being a problem leaving it. But if you'd like to send me a picture to be easier to understand the question with an image.
Okay. Can you discuss the issue of competition between honeybees and native bees?
Yeah, so there has been research on competition, and even honeybee keepers don't want to have too many colonies together because they will compete with each other. And so research has found that if a bunch of honeybees are brought into an area, that they will displace native pollinators. If they're removed, oftentimes the native pollinators will return. But that's just resource competition. But there are also other issues with honeybees, and we kind of discourage the placement of honeybee colonies in really wild areas because they can carry diseases and parasites that may affect our native bee populations.
Okay. If you have a pollinator-friendly garden, is it close enough to have some bare ground 200 feet away to support brown dusters?
Yeah, there's an awful lot about the location of ground nesting bees that, we can't really predict. So I would just encourage you to maybe scout for the ground nesting bees on your property throughout the year, but especially in the early spring, it's easier to see them. They will use sites that aren't totally bare, but it's just harder to notice them nesting. And for instance, a friend of mine in her neighborhood in Asheville, there's a bunch of cotoneaster on one of her neighbors' yards, and that is just full of ground nesting bees. They're all living underneath the shrubs, and so the bees are pretty opportunistic. It's just a matter of if the soil is the right quality. So you could also try making some adobe bricks, or Sam Droege with the USGS, he has a straw bale house, and bees nest in his house walls. So you can do those kinds of things. But 200 feet is plenty close.
Okay, great. Will a non-Native American beautyberry provide pollination services? This person thought they had a native, and after planting discovered that the berries don't wrap around the stem, meaning that it's not the native.
Yeah, most of our nectar producing plants will attract a lot of generalist pollinators, and so it probably should be fine. I don't know if it'll attract the rustic Sphinx moth, which if you check out the slideshow on the actually the rustic Sphinx moth was the one that you all saw in the slide at the one. I'll just go back. Let me see if I can. Oh, maybe I can't. Let's see. That's the rustic Sphinx moth. So I don't know if it would be attracted to the non-native one or not. And it's an awfully beautiful Sphinx moth. And of course, it sounds like you might not have the same kind of berry display with that one as well. But in terms of nectar, I suspect you can just keep a close eye on it and see who comes visit and to find your answer.
Okay. While you're going back to slides, can you put up the slide with the tiny URL?
Yes. There you go.
All right. Thank you. I have many ground nesting bees in a patchy area of my meadow. I would like to expand the meadow, but don't want to bother the ground nesters. Is there a way to plant around them, or a time of year that the nests are not being used?
Yeah. So they generally nest relatively deeply. So if you're using tillage, then if you just are using shallow tillage, or if you're using a smother method, then just do that in the summertime when they aren't active. And if you want to, be sure that you're not disturbing them, you could just monitor the area for one season to see. There are some other ground nesters, like the native cicada killer wasps that nest in the ground, and they only emerge in late summer, in middle of summer, late July and early August. So you might, if you put down tarp or something, then you might disturb them if they're using that habitat. So, but if you're using tillage, if you can just avoid any kind of deep tillage, then most of the bees or wasps should be okay, that are nesting a little bit deeper than 6 inches.
Okay. Will deer repellent sprayed on plants deter bees or bother pollinators?
Yes, it will. Yeah, bees use their scent. They use their antennae, actually, are kind of their noses, and so some things like garlic that are used to repel insects would interfere with pollinators. It won't harm them, but they might not smell some of the other good things that are around.
Okay. This person lives in an urban area where there are a lot of poison bait traps for rats. Do these pose a problem for pollinators?
Well, I guess it depends on I guess some pollinators do pick up pelletized pesticides. I'm not sure what the rat poisons look like. But I live in Greensboro, North Carolina, and I only learned this year that we have a native rat. It looks much more like a large mouse. And so, you might feel differently about the native rat than the European one. So you might want to just make sure and try to educate your neighbors about those rats to understand, so you'd want to contact Extension to understand what the dangers are in your particular neighborhood.
I think that might be an upward ballot, trying to convince your neighbors. No. These are nice native rats.
Yeah. Well, gosh, if you see them, they are really adorable. They just look like big mice. They just have really cute faces, and yeah. So, and some of they're actually called a wood rat, and some of them are actually rare in some areas. So.
Okay, moving on. I'm always confused if I'm seeing colettes or andrina in the spring. Is there a way to identify the different bees?
Gosh, I have the same problem. I know they always say the Coletes has kind of more of a heart-shaped face, and but I have a very hard time seeing that. So the andrina tend to be more present, and I should know the answer to this question, but Coletes are much less common where I am, so I haven't really gotten as familiar with them. And but that's another question. I will double check, because I think there's probably something to do with their the hairs on their legs that may be different. So let me see if I can find that out, and I'll let Penny know.
Excellent. I'm having a problem with carpenter bees on my house, which are then attracting woodpeckers. Is there a way to get rid of the carpenter bees without pesticides?
Yeah, so that's a really big issue in my region. The carpenter bee damage, you never hear of old buildings coming down from carpenter bee damage, but once the woodpeckers discover them, then they can really do a job quickly, especially if it's a pileated. So in the past, we used to say, well, you can paint wood, and that discourages the carpenter bees. But now that we don't use toxic paints, then the bees have figured that out, and they go right through those paints as well. So one thing that's recommended, if you don't want carpenter bees, you can use the synthetic or the plastic wood. I forget what it's called, Trex maybe. And one thing, this is something that the biologist in North Carolina, Elsa Youngstedt, she is doing research on carpenter bees. So I suspect she will have some answers to these questions that are better than I can provide today. But one thing I wonder, since they are territorial, if you provided nesting blocks like in Mexico for passion flower pollination, they're wonderful for pollinating passion vine. They actually provide nesting blocks. And so I wondered, if you provided some good nesting material, would one male, keep the other families from nesting nearby? So that would be worth trying, putting out some nesting blocks and seeing if you could discourage them from being in the area where you don't want them.
Okay. This person is talking about cutting back perennials, and another is asking us similar questions about wildflowers in terms of timing for cutting back and stem nesting bees.
Yeah, so, and I know you had Heather Holm speaking last year, but I don't know if she talked about her method, but she does some landscaping work, and she tries to, in the fall, if her clients are very particular, to cut back stems but leave them a couple feet tall. So that actually opens up the stem, so the bees might even be more likely to nest in them. And it can also look neater. But of course, you want to leave the seed heads as much as possible for other wildlife and birds and things. So that's why Chris Laloya, when she's cleaning up at the NC Botanical Garden, she doesn't want to throw away all those stems because they could have cavity nesting, not only bees, but other critters in them. And sometimes the larvae are really, really tiny and hard to see. But what you could do is cut a few stems and just split it open and see if you have much nesting happening. And then, if you didn't really find anything, then you wouldn't have to be so concerned. But if you want to just use a precautionary principle, then you could make a wattle or just make a pile of your extra stems and let them, stay close by, so that if there are any bees nesting in there, they might have a chance to emerge.
Okay. Are the common violets that many of us are seeing all over our yards at this time of spring, are they supporting pollinators in any way?
Yes, I think we actually have a specialist. I don't know if it's an Andrina that uses the violet flowers. And then there are fritillary butterflies that lay their eggs on the violet leaves later, in the season when they return to the area. So, yeah. Well, I don't know for sure if the fritillaries, how much they pollinate, but but they support beautiful butterflies and some bees. And I'm sure there's also some beetles and flies that will visit those flowers as well.
Okay. Is the spring beauty bee a ground nester?
Yes, I think you mean, yes, it is a ground nester. And that they're really fun to see because you can see their legs are all covered in bright, a pink pollen from the spring beauty. So.
Okay. And we have time for just one last question, but I'll also mention that a couple of people have supplied some resource links that I will include when I send out the email that I send to all of you with the link to the recording
Great.
and the PDF that's been mentioned. And the last question is, are there any shade-loving plants that can support pollinators in an area in the mid-Atlantic with about 4 hours of sun a day?
Oh, yeah. So one of my favorite plants is black cohosh, and that will flower in pretty deep shade. And all of our gingers, those produce the dark burgundy flowers under them. Basically, all of our, especially spring ephemeral flowers, Jacob's Ladder, and then right now the golden groundsel is in flower. The groundsel that I had in that one wildflower photo is a different species. That's a sun-loving species, but the typical Pacara aurea is a shade-tolerant species. And yeah, I'm pretty sure that workhorse list that I mentioned on the FHA would include shade-tolerant species. But if you want some other ideas, please feel free to write to me. And as I think of other things, I'll be happy to send those to you.
Very good. Well, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation, Dr. Adamson. Has just been delightful to learn about what we can do and will inspire us to go out and plant lots of native plants for the specialists and the generalists. So thank you again, and we look forward to learning more about your research as you go along.
Well, thank you so much, Penny, and everyone for joining us again